By 1920, consensus was that the regulation of the railroad industry had been too one-sided in favor of the railroad's customers, not permitting the railroad sufficient profit to maintain a world-class rail system. So Congress passed the Transportation Act of 1920, which was intended to be more friendly toward the railroads. The Transportation Act of 1920 made several significant changes. For the first time, the ICC was instructed to consider the financial health of the railroads, in addition to the interests of their customers, when making decisions regarding rates and other matters. The law said that the railroads were entitled to a reasonable rate of return, although the law did not define what constituted reasonable. Over time, the ICC and the court seemed to settle on a figure of 6%. In addition, the law authorized the ICC to take those profits above a reasonable rate of return and redistribute them to other, less profitable railroad companies to support less profitable rail lines. But the most important change the law implemented was conferring on the ICC the authority to review, block or modify routes, railroad mergers, and line abandonments. If a railroad proposed starting a new line or abandoning an existing line, or if it proposed merging with another railroad company, the ICC could block such changes. It also had the power to approve such changes while imposing conditions on them. In making such decisions, the ICC was supposed to consider both the effects on the financial health of the railroads, as well as the effects on the communities they served. This represented a significant increase in the ICC's regulatory power over the railroads. In theory, these changes were supposed to create a regulatory climate that was more sensitive to the financial needs of the railroads. This didn't really happen. After the law's passage, the ICC did become more willing to allow rate increases. But this only created a political backlash. In fact, the issue of rail rates was one of the major issues in the 1924 presidential election. In 1924, Congress passed a resolution calling upon the ICC to favor customers over the railroads in rate-setting disputes, but it was non-binding, and the law itself was left intact. After Congress decided to end funding for the National Road in 1840, road building in the United States had been left to private developers, and to the states. But the invention of the car, and the difficulties of World War I, left some federal lawmakers searching for ways to involve the national government in developing a nationwide system of roads and highways. But once again, constitutional and political concerns shaped the initial federal response. The first law in the 20th century to provide federal funding for roads was the Federal Road Act of 1916. This law provided $75 million for road construction on a 50-50 matching basis, but it could only be spent on postal roads in small communities of 2,500 people or fewer. The law was limited to postal roads for constitutional reasons. The Constitution does not specifically give the federal government the power to create roads. However, the Constitution explicitly gives the federal government the power to establish and operate a postal system. Limiting the law to postal roads placed it on a firmer constitutional footing. The law was limited to small rural communities for political reasons. Rural communities tend to be conservative, and tend to oppose federal spending, except when it benefits themselves. Limiting the bill to rural communities was intended to increase conservative support. However, this law represented the camel's nose under the tent. Subsequent laws increased the amount of federal funding available, and eventually, federal spending was expanded to include urban as well as rural areas. The Federal Road Act was important for another reason. It required states receiving federal funding to establish a professional state highway department. By 1918, all 48 states had complied. These state agencies were required to set transportation priorities, create detailed plans, issue progress reports, and submit to audits. This marked the beginning of the professionalization of highway planning. 1925 was significant because, in that year, the Federal Bureau of Public Roads completed arrangements with all of the states to have uniform route markings, and to designate north-south highways as odd numbers, and east-west highways as even numbers. This marked the beginning of the national standardization of the highway system.
But all good roads are part of one great pattern, the interstate system, that serves the whole nation. The great primary roads that connect the cities, and then the roads that feed into this system. We need good secondary roads to serve the rural population and small towns of America.
In 1944, Congress passed a law authorizing the expenditure of $20 billion for the construction of a 40,000-mile national highway system, but due to World War II and its aftermath, only small amounts were actually spent. The real change came with the passage of the Federal Highway Act of 1956. That law created the interstate highway system as we know it today. It envisioned spending $27 billion on 41,000 miles of highway, with a target completion date of 1972. The project was funded by raising the existing tax on gasoline by 3 cents per gallon, along with other taxes on tires, trucks, and other sources, and dedicating that funding to highways. Over time, that tax has increased, most recently being raised to 18.3 cents a gallon in 1993. The passage of this law marked the beginning of the interstate era. Meanwhile, the motor carrier, or trucking industry, was rising as a threat to the railroads. In many ways, the railroad industry and the trucking industry are very different. It's hard to start a railroad company, but it's easy to start a trucking company. Nevertheless, many of the same problems that once plagued the railroads also affected motor carriers. Hypercompetition meant that service was often shoddy, prices were often arbitrary, and profits were low. The history of regulating the motor carrier industry has striking parallels with the history of regulating the railroad industry. With regard to railroads, the first regulations were adopted by the states. It was only after the U.S. Supreme Court decided that state regulations exceeded their constitutional authority that the federal government finally stepped in. This exact same pattern prevailed with regard to trucking. In the early 20th century, states began to regulate trucking rates and routes, and these laws were challenged in court. In 1925, in the case of Buck v. Cook et al., the Supreme Court declared that a Washington state law regulating trucking routes was unconstitutional. This decision led to a ruinous trade war, increasing calls for federal regulation that eventually resulted in the passage of the Motor Carrier Act of 1935. The Motor Carrier Act was closely modeled on the various laws regulating the railroad industry. It gave the ICC similar powers over trucking rates, as well as routes, mergers, and abandonments. But beginning in 1956, the focus of the federal government would be the completion of the interstate highway system.